Peter Best. Welcome to Meet the Expert, the series of podcasts on swine health management in practice brought to you by Boehringer Ingelheim. In this episode, it's my pleasure to be talking to Dr. Klaus Depner. Dr. Depner is a virologist located in northern Germany, where he heads a small working group called Transboundary Animal Disease Management within the Institute of International Animal Health, One Health, at the Friedrich Loeffler Institute, or FLI, the German Federal Institute for Animal Health. Hello, Dr. Depner. Thank you for this opportunity to talk about a particularly topical aspect of transboundary animal disease management, which is current knowledge about African swine fever. You yourself have quite some track record of dealing with ASF in various countries, don't you?
Hello, Peter. Good morning to everybody. Yes, I had the opportunity to work with African swine fever already after I finished my veterinary school. That was in the early 19th when I was in Africa. I was there heading in Namibia in the Central Vet Laboratory, the Department of Virology, and I was very fortunate since I had a senior colleague, a pathologist, who one day called me to the pathology room, postmortem room, and showed me the first two pigs which had African swine fever and explained me this disease. And that was already one of my first lessons, which I learned regarding African swine fever. He explained me that in Africa, domestic pigs is quite difficult to be raised because of African swine fever and this contact to the warthogs, which are a reservoir. And if you want to keep pigs in Africa outdoor, you have to have double fences. So the lesson was that by double fencing your pigs, you might be in a position to prevent them from infection. So that is how it started with African swine fever. However, afterwards, so many years passed and I became an expert in classical swine fever, and I forgot African swine fever until 2007 when it came back to Europe, to the Caucasus region, to Georgia.
As an expert in virology, how do you view the African swine fever virus? I must admit that I find it difficult to compare ASF with other viruses active in swine.
Yeah, as I mentioned, I was working many years then with classical swine fever, also viral disease of pigs, also very dangerous disease. And what happens is that these two diseases, African and classical swine fever, are indeed indistinguishable from a clinical point of view or pathological point of view. With other words, if you have two pigs in front of you, the one has African and the other one has classical swine fever, you will not be able to distinguish them. That is also a fatal, mistake which you can do when you think you know everything about classical swine fever, and only because these diseases are resembling, you may know how to handle African swine fever. And that is what I made at the beginning. I used my classical swine fever knowledge to fight African swine fever, and it's not working. They are completely two different diseases, completely different epidemiology, completely different behavior of the virus. And that is what one has to learn. Each disease is on its own. The only help he has is that he recognizes that it's swine fever, but he cannot tell if it is a classical or African swine fever. And then when it's clear that it's African swine fever, then control and eradication has to follow another philosophy, another mindset. It has something to do with the contagiosity of the diseases. There are different ways. There are different. There's the transmission of the disease, which is different. And knowing all that, you might use different methods. So classical swine fever is rather a fast-spreading disease, And African swine fever is a slow disease, it's a very slow disease, and that one should know.
I hear about theoretical risks, but how exactly do domestic pigs most often become infected with ASF? You mentioned warthogs and ticks in Africa and so on, but they're not here in Europe, where you and I are located. What, in fact, is the most common route of infection?
So we have two ways of infection. The one you mentioned already, say the African way, where we have ticks, soft ticks, which might transmit the virus from one pig to another. So you need the ticks as a vector. But here in Northern Europe, we do not have this tick. So the infection takes place via direct contact. So one pig has to have direct contact to the virus. And it's not a droplet infection like we see it now, for example, for corona, or as we know it from foot and mouth disease, or for classical swine fever, where the virus enters the stable by droplets or by wind, possibly. In African swine fever, it has to be carried physically inside the stable, and only humans are doing that. So you have to bring the virus into the stable, and this virus has somehow to enter the mouth or to be to go under the skin of the pig. So it needs a real direct, strong contact, and then you will have the infection. And therefore, the contagiousness is completely different to an airborne disease or to a droplet infection disease like foot and mouth, for example.
I'm trying to think of the routes, though. Is the main risk, therefore, when you say taking it inside the body, is that from giving the pigs contaminated feed and water? Is that where it most often happens?
Yes, that's probably the most often way now how it happens. The pigs are fed with, say, in the backyard system with leftovers from the kitchen, which might be contaminated, so with swill, or contaminated forage is entering, or contaminated water is finding its way to the pig stable, and that's the way how the pigs get infected. Some of them, not all. That's also something which we had to learn. So if you have, for example, 10 pigs and you feed them all with the same amount of contaminated food or give them the same amount of contaminated water, you will realize that only 1 or 2 or 3 probably will pick up infection, the other ones not. So it's very difficult at the end to infect a pig. But once a pig gets infected, that happens, then most probably it will die. So the case fatality is over 95%. So once infected, the animal will die, but it's difficult to infect it, to infect the animal.
I understand then, with such as with waste feed, that is a risk factor. I can see that could be. What about water? I'm less clear. How does water become contaminated with this virus? Is this human action?
Of course. So with water, we don't have real clear scientific evidence how it works out in the field, but there have been made some nice experiments in the United States where contaminated water has been given to pigs, and even small amounts of virus succeeded to infect the pig. So what is more important is that how often a pig is drinking infected water, and once of these events will lead to an infection. And I think if, for example, a pig has a small lesion in its mouth, which often happens, so that the contaminated water, so virus particle, can immediately go in this wound or directly in the blood, then infection might happen. So that's a point which must be seen. And what might happen in the field is, say, in the backyard system or more remote places, people, they throw away their carcasses out in the water, they are floating, and somewhere else water is taken out for giving it to pigs. And that might be a circle how the infection might take place. But it's not proven, it's just hypothetical,
Okay, but does this mean that effective biosecurity to keep out ASFV is quite straightforward in practice?
Of course. So actually, African swine fever, at least in domestic pigs, I'm not talking about wild boar at the moment, but at least in domestic pigs is a disease where you clearly can prevent yourself, because it's at the end of the day, if you think it's a human-made disease. So the humans are the one who facilitate infection. And so you can prevent your pigs from African swine fever with biosecurity. Definitely.
And you've seen this in practice,
Of course,
such as herds that are careful about their feeding and their human interaction.
Yeah.
That actually works in practice.
I can give you a very nice example. I was once so I have done very many field investigations. So I visited many farms in different countries which were affected by the disease. And once I was in a remote Caucasian village up in the mountain. They had about, say, 6,000 pigs there in different households. So one household had about 20 to 30 animals, and all but one household survived. So died. All pigs died. Not only in one household, the pigs survived. And we asked the owner, say, what are you doing that all other pigs in the village died, only yours survived? And he said, okay, I have 3 rules. The one is only me and my wife are entering the stable, feeding the animals. The second one, I only use commercial feed, so no kitchen leftovers. And the third one, when I enter the stable, I change my shoes and take boots. So 3 basic biosecurity rules who prevented the infection in a stable. And that was really a very convincing example for me. And I always use it when I teach people about biosecurity and tell them, look, biosecurity had two sides. The one is the hardware, I call it, where everything depends on the quality of stables, fences, and all this stuff which you can buy with money. And the other one is the software biosecurity, where everything is depending on the philosophy, on the management, which is a matter of education. And if you don't have a good software, the best hardware will not protect you.
Let me pause for a moment to remind everyone that more information on this conversation, like articles, publications and videos, can be found on the website pers.com. Now, you did mention wild boar, so I need to ask you a bit about that, if I may, Dr. Depner. Of course, we hear a lot about the role of wild boar as a reservoir of infection. You mentioned years ago in Europe, I remember in the 60s, 70s, 80s, it was in Spain and in Sardinia particularly, the role of the wild boar was mentioned. But does the ASF virus affect wild boar in much the same way as domestic pigs? I'm not clear on that point.
So from a purely biological point of view, the wild boar is equally susceptible for the disease like domestic pigs. So the clinical development in wild boar is identical. So there's no difference. The only difference which you have at the end of the day is the way how wild boar live in the completely different setup in the forest, and their density and their management is completely different to the domestic pigs, which then gives also a different view of the disease from the populational point of view. But on the individual level, it's absolutely the same. And reservoir, yes, that's nearly, it's not the right word. So what happens is the wild boar would get infected, and also the infection takes place if humans are littering and are throwing contaminated food out in the forest. Then one wild boar will pick up the infection, will get sick, will die. And now what comes is that the virus as such is quite resistant, so it survives, for example, the process of putrefaction. And then you have there a carcass lying around for 1 or 2 weeks, which still remains a kind of source of infection for other wild boar. And that is the way how the virus survives in the environment, due to these carcasses which are for a while infectious for other wild boar. So that is the way how the virus survives. No? We see,
Just to be clear, though, if I may, Dr. Depner, a wild boar becomes infected and is just as likely to die and not to survive as a domestic
no, there
pig.
is no
There
difference.
is
It's
no
absolutely the
difference
same.
from that perspective. Now, if either a domestic pig or a wild boar survives the infection, does it always become a carrier of the virus?
Yeah, the carrier discussion is a hot discussion. So, first of all, only few animals will survive the virus. So, I told you that case fatality is about 95%. Not to be confused with the mortality, which is often made. So, the case fatality is the percentage of the animals which die out of the group which really got infected, while the mortality is the percentage of the animal which die out of the stable or the forest. So we can have in a domestic stable a case fatality of 90%, but mortality of 9%, no? Just for that. However, the ones which survive, they might, in the worst case, might for 2-3 months still react positive in the diagnostic tests for virus, not for antibodies, but they do not shed virus, or very few of them would shed virus. So we will not have them as a spreader. So the question really is, do they play an epidemiological role in this epidemic? So if imagine you have a forest with hundreds of wild boar and several of them die due to African swine fever and carcasses of really infectious animals are lying around, which role does a survivor play in this setup? No role, at least epidemiologically, no role. What can imagine is you have such an animal which survives, and somewhere might be still some virus in a lymph node or somewhere hidden in this animal, and this animal will die due to whatsoever other reason, and another wild boar would eat up this animal. Then you can construct something like that, but there's really a very, very hypothetical construction. They are not. Experiments have been done where survival animals have been put together with naive animals, and they could not infect them. So these survival animals are not. They might theoretically be carriers. You cannot deny it, but they don't play a role in the epidemic.
Then I'm going to go back to your point about the virus being contagious, please. Within the farm, you've got infected pigs. They don't show the disease immediately, but they become infected and sometimes are able to pass the infection to other pigs in the vicinity nearby them. But they tend not to pass it to every pig nearby, as we've seen. I'm not quite clear, therefore, if the survivors are not spreading and the pigs that are in the early stages of infection before they are shedding themselves, how does the contagion happen before you see a disease incident?
Yeah. I would like to rephrase a little bit this topic. So what happens in a farm, usually happens in a farm, is as follows. You have one pig in a pen, for example, one of 10 pigs in a pen, which gets infected. And this one pig will become sick and will die. And now, if it remains in the pen overnight, it is not taken out. The other 9 pigs, which are healthy, start to nibble and lick. And that's the moment when they get infected. So that's the way how it normally happens out in the field. So while a pig is incubating the virus or is even sick, it's not shedding too much. And the other ones, they do not pick up the infection. Now, if you have a farm made up of 2 pigs, for example, only 2 pigs, a backyard, and one pig of these 2 pigs will die, and you go into the stable in the morning and you see that one of your 2 pigs is dead, so 50% mortality, it's impossible that you will not realize this event. But now you have a farm of 10,000, 20,000 pigs, and one pig dies, even with nice clinical signs or pathological symptoms. You might ignore that one because the mortality, now I speak about mortality, due to African swine fever is so low at the beginning, it's below the normal farm mortality which you normally have. In large farm, for example, you expect, you have a normal mortality of 2 or 3% depending on what category of pigs you have there. And the first weeks, the deaths caused by African swine fever are below the normal mortality. And even with science, people ignore them. And then suddenly you have an exponential mortality. So at the beginning, one pig died this week, then 2 in the next week, and suddenly you have 10, 20, 30 pigs dying within 2 days. And then is the moment that you realize something, because then the process becomes faster and exponential. But it's not like that the first ones which died had no symptoms or no signs or no pathology, only that you have ignored them because it's below that what you expect. It's very tricky. So we have large farms where it takes us 4, 5, 6, 2 months, 3 months until we realize the disease is there.
It must be tricky, I'm sure, to investigate when and how the virus has entered the farm because of the duration of that process.
Yeah, it's very difficult because, what can help you is you go back in if there are good farm records, and you go back in the mortality data, and you will see so very small peaks of mortality, which did not worry you, but retrospectively you can realize that might have been a moment where the disease could have entered. So mortality data will help you to realize how long the disease is there. And also clinical data, if you have good records, also might help you. And also, laboratory data might help you with the results. If you will find a pig, for example, which is positive also for virus as for antibodies, then you know that animal is one of the famous survivors. And if he survived, the infection must have been a few weeks before. No? So there are some indicators and some tricks how you might narrow the date when the virus might have entered the farm.
There must, I guess, also be implications for how we undertake routine surveillance of swine herds in those areas where ASF is known to exist before we're aware of any disease in the particular farm. Can serology help us with early detection, for example?
Not at all. Serology is the wrong way to go. So serology is a useful tool in an endemic situation, for example, in wild boar, when you want to see after 2 or 3 years how far the disease went. But for early detection, there is only one way to go, to check clinically sick animal or dead animal. And particularly in a region where you expect that your farm is under risk. We have introduced in the European Union a few years ago a rule to check the first 2 dead fatteners or sows or boars within a week for African swine fever, independently on what they might have died. So first 2 which die per week, we check for African swine fever. That's the only way how you can get very fast to an early detection. Because if you wait until antibodies are there, then you might have lost already 90% of your farm.
In fact, to me, the tools we have for ASF diagnostics seem quite good. Do we need more pen-side tests, for example, or ways of detecting infected carcasses at an abattoir? Would that help us?
Oh, if we detect African swine fever at the abattoir, then we have slept. So that would be the worst case scenario. If the virus managed to go through all our checks until it reached the abattoir, that means everything what has done before did not work. Early surveillance or monitoring and all these things have not worked. So that should never happen, that we have positive pigs at the abattoir. At the abattoir, people only will check if there are signs, pathological signs, and that should not happen. Yes, you asked me about the lateral flow devices. They are now more or less new diagnostic tools on the market. They might be useful, in the field, particularly for epidemiological investigations. If you have a sick animal in front of you or a dead animal, and you do a test with a lateral flow device, and the test is negative, then most probably that was not African swine fever which killed that animal. But a sick animal due to African swine fever will always, or nearly always, react positive. So it would be a help for you to clarify the suspicion which you have. And it could be used in a strategic way. You can use the lateral flow devices for surveillance and monitoring in a farm to see which stables are affected, which are not affected, and this kind of stuff. Yeah.
I'm going to pause for a minute, Doctor, just to say to our listeners and viewers, thank you for joining us in this podcast, where we're talking to virologist Dr. Klaus Depner in Germany about African swine fever virus. I'm going to continue with this conversation with him, but thank you for joining us today, and we always appreciate feedback from you on all the episodes of Meet the Expert.
Thank you very much also.
Dr. Depner, I'm going to switch a little bit. At local or farm level, not a national level, what are our options in practice? Do we eradicate ASF or do we live with it?
So for domestic pigs, we should be able to eradicate. If we have more or less a good functioning veterinary service, it should not be a problem on the domestic pig side. So as I told you, it is a very slow disease. So you come to a farm where it's African swine fever there, you take your measures, and if you do everything properly, you might be confident that you eradicate the disease before this disease escaped from that farm to the neighboring farm. If you would have foot and mouth disease that we have seen, for example, in the UK and also elsewhere, you come to the farm and the virus is already gone. It's escaped to the neighboring farm because that is droplet infection, much faster, highly contagious. And African swine fever is not highly contagious. It gives you time to do your measures, but you have to do them then properly. And you may be able in the position to eradicate the disease. With wild boar, it's complicated, but domestic pigs, it should work. And it also worked in many countries. So we have good examples where they were able to eradicate it in domestic pigs.
We know ASF can be contained on one farm, Doctor. It's not blown in the wind or carried by insects to reach other farms in the neighbourhood. But how good can we be at stopping it spreading from one barn to other barns on the same site?
Oh, that's a little bit more difficult because once you have a pen or a barn where you have one or two positive pigs, you can't be sure that the other ones which had direct contact to this pig are not already infected, incubating the virus. So the point is rather how we can prevent. So if I have a farm made up of 4 or 5 buildings or stables, how we can prevent that the disease is not jumping from one stable to the next. Inside a stable, I would not be confident that I can stop it, but from stable to stable, so from building to building, there might be the chance that we can stop it.
If the stable is divided into rooms, does that improve our possibility to contain it within one compartment or room of a stable, or is that very difficult?
Theoretically, yes, it's difficult. It's a matter also how good the biosecurity, the inside farm biosecurity is working, how good the management is working, how many personnel you have, because at a certain stage you have to really isolate it 100%. So you do not have to have the same people doing the work in different rooms, for example, or you have also maybe to separate the feeding and the water supply. So inside a building, I see there a problem. As I said, it's a management issue and it's an issue of, from farm to farm. But on the other hand, it's also a legal request. So if you have African swine fever, at least with the legislation in the European Union, you have to cull all the animals independently. If you have only found one which is positive and the farm has 10,000 animals, you still have to cull them all.
Are there alternatives to culling all the pigs on a farm where ASF has been shown to be present? I'd be particularly interested in your view of a system or process of partial depopulation that's being proposed in Asia, which means effectively taking out only the infected pigs rather than destroying every pig on the farm. Some people call it the tooth extraction technique. Can it work?
We call it modified culling. So, as I told you, you have on the one side the legislation which obliges you to do certain measures, which under circumstances you have to cull the whole farm. But as I told you, African swine fever is a very slow disease. So you have theoretically the chance to save partially parts of the farm. It very much depends when you enter the scene. So if you detect African swine fever and you have already hundreds of infected pigs on that farm, dead pigs on that farm, that means you are very late. You enter the farm very late, so the disease is quite far spread within the farm. So in that situation, you might not succeed to save much. But if you are good in early detection and you diagnose the disease only when the disease is in one single pen in one house and only few animals, then you really have good chances to go for this modified culling system. However, then you need for a strategy for the weeks afterwards where you have a good proper monitoring of the rest, that you make really sure that the disease did not escape from that particular part where you found it first. But we have, for example, we have had farms where hundreds of pigs were already dead or positive or sick. And in such a scenario, it's nearly impossible to do modified culling because the disease, they waited too long until measures were taken. So depends how fast you are in early detection. Then you have a chance. That would be my answer.
Yes, thanks. Just for information, I was reminded of the fact that modified depopulation has been tried before in Europe. I've got a paper from 30 years ago where it was talking about the eradication plan in Spain that was introduced in 1987 and where they were testing for antibodies. Then, if they found a low prevalence, they would only cull the ones shown to have antibodies to show exposure to the infection. Note that this was in swine breeding herds, not all swine herds. But the other question I had for you, that was at a time when they were dealing with genotype 1. And this seemed to become gradually less acute. We've got genotype 2 in Europe now. Do you see any chance that this will become less acute with time?
I have just to make a remark to the Spanish situation 30, 40 years ago. At that stage, we had a quite difficult situation because an attempt was made to vaccinate against African swine fever with an attenuated virus, which was not really 100% attenuated. And so it was still able to create mild forms so the pig survived and created mild forms of the disease and produced antibodies. And from that point of view, you had infected farms with an attenuated vaccine virus, and that created a little bit of confusion. And of course, under certain circumstances, you had to test for antibodies and to take the seropositive pigs out. So that was a different story at that time. Genotype 1 viruses, they also have a high case fatality, so they kill the animal exactly like genotype 2. And I think it's not so. From an evolutionary point of view, the time is too short that we have an adaptation now, that we have an attenuated strain which survives or which has an advantage in the evolution. It's not like the warthog story in Africa, where it took hundreds of thousands of years until the virus and the host got in a agreement. African swine fever in domestic pigs is only 200-300 years old. When we went to Africa, colonizing Africa, and brought our European pigs there, and even with wild boar, the disease in wild boar is not 20 years old. So from an evolutionary point of view, that's nothing. There's no time enough to have an adaptation that the host is adapted to the virus or vice versa. We have still to fight, so it will take time.
I'm afraid we've come to the end of this particular podcast, Dr. Depner. Yes. May I tell our listeners that you've kindly agreed to a second podcast with me where we're talking about national policies and so on. But for the moment, many thanks to our listeners for joining us. We've been talking to Dr. Klaus Depner in Germany about the African swine fever virus. As you hear, there'll be an extra conversation between us in a further podcast. But for the moment, thank you for joining us and goodbye. We want to remind you that more information on this conversation, like articles, publications and videos, can be found on the website pers.com.